welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tyler Smith. I am a PDM specialist here at Hawkridge Systems, and we're going to talk about the process of creating a SQL Express backup, which can be used with your SOLIDWORKS PDM Standard vault. So hopefully at this point, you should know that there are a few different components that we need to back up in order to perform a full restore of our vault in the event of a server or hard drive failure. There is the SQL database component, which we'll talk about today. There is the archive server component, which are the physical files themselves, and then there are the archive server settings. So those are the three main components we'll need. But this webinar isn't about the process of backing up the server, but rather we'll talk specifically about the SQL Express backup process and how we can automate that because we don't have the ability to set up a maintenance plan like we can inside the standard version of SQL. So before I begin, full disclaimer here, the training that I'm going to be doing is purely for information purposes. So we will step through the process of creating a SQL Express backup and show how we can automate that, but it is your responsibility as the end user to ensure that both the databases, the database backups are being created and that those backups are usable. So just watching this training and following the instructions here doesn't exempt you from that responsibility as the user. And then also, full disclosure, this walkthrough that I'm going to be doing is based on a Microsoft Knowledge Base article. So that's where some of this text originally came from. But with that being said, let's get in and talk about the programs that we're going to use. So the first thing that we're going to use is the SQL Server Management Studio. And if that wasn't installed when you installed SQL, which it should have been, but if it wasn't, that is downloadable for free directly from Microsoft. So if you just search SQL Server Management Studio, you should be able to find that. We're also going to be using a text editor, in this case Notepad. We'll also use Command Prompt, and then finally Windows Task Scheduler. So those three programs there, Notepad, Command Prompt, and Task Scheduler, should all be default installed applications on any Windows machine. And there are three main steps that we're going to perform over the course of this training. The first thing that we're going to do is create what's called a stored procedure, and we're going to create that inside the SQL Server Management Studio, and that's what's going to allow us to create the backup. Then we're going to create a batch file that will allow us to execute that stored procedure, as well as it will allow us to input some information about the databases that we want to back up and the backup type. And then finally, we're going to create a schedule so that this will happen automatically at a time that we specify. So this first step is in creating the stored procedure is to go into the SQL Server Management Studio. So that's what I'm going to do here. And when the Management Studio opens up, it's going to prompt me to connect to one of my SQL servers. And in this case, my machine has multiple SQL instances on it. So I will want to be careful to make sure that it's pointed to the correct SQL instance that I want. In this case, the Express instance. And if you used a default named instance when you installed SQL, what you may have for your server name, it may be MS SQL Server. That is the default named instance, but in this case I have a named instance, SQL Express, for my SQL Express instance. and I'm going to use Windows authentication, and I'll connect. And once this is connected, I'm going to browse into my databases node, and we'll see that we have our system databases. That is a default installed component, and then we have our actual databases here. So the database that we're going to be backing up today is the Acme database. Another thing that we need to back up is also the Kinesio Master DB. So originally, the PDM system was developed by a company called Kinesio, which was then purchased by SOLIDWORKS. So this is the master database for the PDM system, and that's why it's called Kinesio Master DB, because Kinesio was the name of the original developer. But if any of you, and hopefully you have taken the PDM Standard admin training, the admin manual will talk about when you want to take a backup, you'll need to back up both your database, so your Vault database, as well as this Kinesio Master DB. So we'll talk about how to create the backup for both of these. And then these other databases, this is just another Vault, another PDM Standard Vault that I have. And then this TEW SQL Express, this is actually a database for SOLIDWORKS Electrical. So we're not going to worry about these bottom two here. But in order to create this stored procedure, I'm going to open up the System Databases node. I'll go to this master database. I'll open up the Programmability node. And then I'm going to go to Stored Procedure here. And you'll see right now there's the System Stored Procedures, but then there's nothing under that. So hopefully once we've created our stored procedure, it'll appear under this System Stored Procedures. So I'm going to right-click on that Stored Procedures and select Stored Procedure. And I'm going to delete out the text that we see here. So this text will help you create a new procedure, but in this case, we're just going to be copying and pasting text from the document that I've created that walks through this SQL backup process. Again, the original location of this information in the text that we're going to be copying is actually from this specific knowledge base article. But what I've done in the walkthrough document is I've removed some excess text that they've added on there and just pared it down to what we really need. So I'm going to copy and paste this from my Word document, and this should be attached to this video, so you should have access and be able to download this yourself. And I'm going to copy that and paste this into this query window here. And once this is done, I want to save this query. And I'm just going to save it in the default location here. You most likely will not have any other queries here, but if there are, you may want to consider giving it a new name and saving that. And after I've saved it, I'm going to execute this query. And I should see commands completed successfully. And then if I were to refresh this databases node, what I should see under stored procedures is that database object called backup databases. So that's what we've just created there. That is the stored procedure that we're then going to use to run this backup. So that is the first step. That is the stored procedure. And again, we created that inside the SQL Server Management Studio. The next thing that we're going to do is create a batch file. And we're going to do that using a notepad file. So if you had another text editor that you want to use, you can do that as well, as long as it can save files with a .bat for batch file extension. So I'll go ahead and close out of this. And I'm going to open up Notepad. And I'm going to go back to my walkthrough document here and locate the text for my batch file. And I'm going to copy and paste that in. And some things to note here, this SQL command -s, that will remain the same, but there's some other things that we'll need to change here. So the first one being the server name. We should change the server name to match whatever machine is hosting the vault or hosting the SQL database component, which in my case is bot-tyler-s, but obviously yours will be something different. And then we'll also need to specify the SQL instance name. So in my case, I have a SQL Express named instance, which is just called SQL Express, but that again may be different on your machine. It might be, if it's a default named instance, MS SQL Server, but in my case it's just SQL Express. So I'll delete out those brackets. The -E indicates that we're using Windows authentication, which is fine. And then the -Q is indicating that this following text here is going to be executed when we run this batch file. So we'll see it's executing the stored procedure that we just created, the backup databases. And then it shows a backup location that it's going to put that backup into. So in this case, the text that I've provided in the walkthrough is going to just put it in the default location for SQL backups. You may need to modify this section of the text to match whatever your SQL Express instance name is, but otherwise this file path should work for you and should put that file in the default location for the backups. We'll also want to specify our vault name. So in this case, we're backing up the Acme database. And then we have our backup type, which in this case is F. There are a few different backup types that we can do, but I'm going to suggest that we always take a full backup, and that's what the F is indicating, that this will be a full SQL backup. And the reason why I'm going to suggest that is if you do have something go wrong, then if you have the full backup, that's all that you'll need to perform the restore. If you take a differential backup, which is another one of the options, you might need multiple backups in order to fully restore the database. So just as a precaution, I think it's always best to take full backups when you're dealing with the PDM system and backing it up. So we'll leave that as an F. And then just a small note here, when I'm copying and pasting things from my file here, we'll see that some of these quotes look a little bit different. They're not exactly the same, and that's because these quotation marks are actually not simple text. But in order for this batch file to run properly, we need to make sure that they are. So what I'm going to do is just delete them and then retype them in, and you'll see that when I retype them in, they look very slightly different. Otherwise, if we don't do that, it's going to give us an error when we try to run this batch file. And I also mentioned before that we want to back up the Kinesio master DB as well. So what I'll do is I'll select this entire line of text. I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to paste it onto a second line. And then for the database name on the second line, I'm going to change it to that Kinesio master DB. And after I've done that, I'm going to save this. And in the Save dialog box, it's going to default to try to save this file with a .txt extension for text documents. But we want this to be a batch file, which requires a .bat file extension. So what we'll do is we'll change this to all files, and then we'll type in our batch file name, which in this case I'll save it as SQL backup.bat, and I'm going to save it right on the C drive, and I'll save that there. And one last thing before I close out of this batch file, if you do decide that you want to put these backups in another location, don't try to write them directly to the C drive, because when you attempt to run this batch file, it's going to give you an error and say access is denied. So it needs to be in at least one folder inside the C drive. It can't be directly on the C drive. So just another thing to be aware of. And now we want to test to ensure that this backup is actually going to work. So the next thing we'll do is open up a command prompt. And once this is open, I'm going to type in cd for change directory, and then I'll type in my C drive and hit enter. And remember, our batch file is saved right on our C drive, so I should now be able to type in SQL backup.bat. And what we should see is two successfully created backups. First, we'll see one for our Acme vault or database, and then we should see one also for the Kinesio master DB, so that PDM master database. So this ensures that there are no issues with our batch file. And again, the second step there after creating the stored procedure was creating that batch file. So we've seen how to do that now inside the notepad. And then again, we performed the test and we executed that SQL backup batch file to ensure that it is running properly, or it will run properly when we execute it. And now finally, what we're going to do is set up a schedule. So with the schedule, we're going to use the Windows Task Scheduler, and then that will allow us to execute the batch file at a specified interval. So I'm going to close out of my command prompt and my notepad here, and I'm going to open up the Windows Task Scheduler. And once this is open, I'm going to go to Actions and Create Task. And the name of this task, I'm going to call it SQL_express_backup. I'm not going to specify a location, but down at the bottom here, I want to select a few of these options, one of them being run whether user is logged in or not. So regardless of whether I'm logged in, I want this backup to run. And then I also don't want to run into any access issues in regards to privileges. Even though I'm a local domain on my machine, I'm still going to use this run with highest privileges checkbox to ensure that that does not become an issue. And because I'm running Windows 7, I'm going to configure this for Windows 7 and for Server 2008 R2. And once I've made those selections, I'm going to go to the Triggers tab, and I'll select New. And this is where we specify the actual schedule for when this will run. And I'm going to select daily, and that's going to be my recommendation, that you run these backups daily. An important thing to note here, we're backing up the database component at this point. I would also recommend taking the archive server component if you're backing that up, which hopefully you are. I would recommend taking that at the same exact time. If those backups are taken at different times and users get in and add files or remove files, you'll find that the SQL database backup and the archive server backup are out of sync, and there are files that may exist only in the database component or only in the archive component. So you'll want to make sure that whatever you specify here for when this backup runs, and in this case I'm just going to have it run at 12 a.m., you'd want the archive server backup to run at roughly the same time, or at least at a time that falls, after this backup is taken, but before any users might get in and actually change the files. And we'll see down at the bottom there are some advanced settings. And in this case, it shouldn't be necessary, but I'm going to use this checkbox, stop task if it runs longer than, and I'll say 4 hours. It's a relatively small database. It should be under 20 megabytes. So there shouldn't be any reason for it to run longer than 4 hours. It should be done almost immediately. So this shouldn't be an issue. But just be aware, if you do have a larger database and you think it's going to take a long time to run the database, you can set this up to stop after a specific amount of time. And after I've set this up, I'm going to hit OK. Then finally, I'm going to go to my Actions tab and select New. And I'm going to choose this Start a Program action, and I'm going to browse to my batch file that I created. And again, that's right on my C drive. So I'll select SQL backup.bat file, hit Open, hit OK. And when I hit OK again, because this is going to create the task, it's actually going to prompt me to log in. So you'll need some level of administrative access on whatever machine you're creating this backup on. So when I hit OK, it's going to prompt me to log in using my admin credentials. And then it will create the task. So if I go to Task Scheduler Library, I can scroll down and locate that scheduled task. So, and if you're looking for this scheduled task in the files themselves, it can be located in your C drive, in the Windows folder, under System 32, and then Tasks. You should see it at the bottom there. So now this backup should be ready to run tomorrow morning at 12:53 a.m. or whenever you've specified for it to run. And again, that's going to be my recommendation, that you have this run every day, sometime when everyone is out of the office. And when this backup is taken, remember, this is your responsibility to ensure that the file is written to the location, and then that backup is usable. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to browse in and locate the backup that should have been taken when I executed the batch file through the command prompt. And I had that file put into the default location on the C drive, under Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server, MS SQL 12, SQL Express, because that was the SQL Express named instance that I'm working with, MS SQL, and then backup. And I should see here was that backup that was taken. And then I should also see the Kinesio Master DB backup that was taken as well at the same time. And neither of them are very large, so they both were taken almost immediately. Again, just like I said, shouldn't take very long for smaller databases. And then when you get to the point where where you have this set up and you have ensured that these database backups are being taken every single day, what I'm going to recommend is checking these databases maybe once a month to ensure that those databases do work. And a way that I might recommend taking or checking the usability of a backup is by installing SQL Server on another machine. Again, SQL Server is free, so you should be able to download that on another machine, and then performing the restore on that backup. And then as long as you can restore the backup and restore the archive server component on that other machine, and you can still access the files in the way that you'd expect, then that should ensure that the files are working properly. Again, a standard disclaimer for this training. What I've shown here is purely for informational purposes, and it is your responsibility as the end user to ensure that both these databases are being taken and that these databases are, or these database backups are usable. So that is the last part of this training. We set up the schedule through the task scheduler, and we have that running daily every morning at 12 a.m., hopefully when everybody's out of the office. So with that, that will conclude the webinar. I want to thank you all for attending this. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to ask those now. And again, the document that I used to base this original training on is the Microsoft Knowledge Base article that you'll see at the bottom of this slide. And then you should see the Word document that walks through this same SQL, automated SQL backup process will be linked below as well. So you'll have access to the same text that I copied and pasted into this training.